Hi, everyone, and welcome to Modern Adulthood Summit. I'm your host, and my name is Carmen Peutz. We're here to talk about how to establish a clear identity, develop intimate relationships, build your career, and still enjoy your adult life. We want to help young adults to navigate to adulthood with lots of support, guidance, and information. So today I have an amazing guest with me, and his name is Dr. Ryne Sherman. Sherman received his PhD in personality and social psychology from the University of California, Riverside in 2011 and is currently an associate professor of psychology at Texas Tech University. He does research on personality and social interactions in daily life and occasionally analysis of large archive data sets. Welcome, Ryne.
Thank you.
Ryne, can you first tell me something about your growing up and where did you grow up and what kind of a family of origin were you growing up and what kind of parents were your parents?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a rural part of Illinois. The town that I grew up in had a population of about 1,800 people. Both of my parents are they both have high school education, but no college education, no university education at all. I would describe them in terms of their parenting style. I would say that they were loving, but also I don't think I would describe them as disciplinarians or anything. But there were rules that we had to follow, and there were consequences for not following rules. But I mean, for the most part, I would say they were pretty typical parents.
So what kind of a young adult were you?
A young adult. Well, I was pretty well behaved, thinking about myself compared to my peers. So like, through teenage years, through college, I stayed on the pretty straight and narrow, kept myself out of a lot of trouble. And then part of this was because I was involved in a lot of athletics. And so by being involved in sports and things like that all the time, I never really felt like I had time to engage in the sort of, let's say, potentially troublesome social teenage activities.
What were that fundamental values that your parents gave you that you would say, oh, they did something right, and this is something that it's very valuable to me, and
Right.
Also I'm gonna pass these values to my children?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one, and I'm sure I get this more from my mom than from my dad, was this sort of tendency to want to follow rules and to learn what the rules are, and then to follow them, and just to and to do. I'm less like this today than I used to be. She's probably more like it, and is probably annoyed that I'm not as rule following as I used to be. But but the rule following, I still have a tendency to think, okay, like this is what you're supposed to do, so you go. And even if it's not a formal rule, if it's sort of an informal rule, like this is what you're supposed to do, so you go do that.
Are you like that with your own children?
Right. So with my own children, I feel like I'm a little more permissive. I mean, I do want them, I do want them to follow rules, but I also feel like there's some advantages to exploring and trying to be creative, not necessarily coloring within the lines all of the time.
Ryne, can you tell me a little bit about your work? What is it that
Sure. Yeah, so most of my work is done on personality and everyday interactions, everyday situations. So in one study we did with people, we had them wear these little cameras. I'll show you. They're about this big around, and they would wear it on their shirt, and it would take a photograph of the places they went automatically every 30 seconds. And so from this study, and we did this with college students, we just finished it last year. So in this study, what we did was we learned a lot about how personality is related to the kinds of places people go, the kinds of interactions that they have. So that's pretty neat. We're still looking at that data because we have lots of photos. We have like 250,000 photos. So there's still a lot to do with that data set. But that's kind of the thing that I do, is study how people interact with their daily environments. One of the other things that I've been doing, and I think of most interest for this series, is the work I've been doing on data analytics from some archival data sets. So the big one that I focused on is what's known in the United States as the General Social Survey. And this is a representative sample of US adults that are, it's not the same adults every year, every 2 years, but it's a new representative sample every year, 2 years, that gets asked a whole host of questions, including lots of things about sexual behavior. And so lots of the work I've done as a collaborator on this project is data analysis of people's sexual attitudes, people's sexual behavior. And I think perhaps the most interesting thing that we found is both time period and generational differences in how in people's attitudes towards sex and their behaviors.
Before going into that, I would like to ask you, you earned your PhD in 2011. And first, if I'm not mistaken, you started as an assistant professor, and now you are an associate professor. And you are working, also in a classroom with students. Do you see any changes in their social activities, personalities from where you started and now?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been doing this for almost, I'm in my 7th year of, well, I mean, if you included graduate school, there's even more, because I was teaching there too. So more than 10 years. Have I noticed a difference in that time frame? I feel like I really haven't seen much of a difference in students' behaviors then. However, somehow I do feel like I was a little bit different. It was a little bit different when I was a student. I mean, and part of it was because when I was in college, but right before I started graduate school, social media really wasn't a big thing. We didn't, I feel like if we took our cell phones to class, most of us didn't take our cell phones to class. But if we did, there wasn't going to really be anything to do with it. Almost no, I don't remember anybody bringing a laptop to class when I was in college. So that would have been like, 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And those kinds of things are different. And I don't know if it really makes the students themselves different, but it certainly makes the classroom environment different when people have access to their phones because there's something going on social media, or they're on their laptop. And, I've sat in on classes as a professor, right? So when you're the professor teaching, you don't always see what's on people's computers. But when you're on the other side sitting in on classes, you see what they're doing. And I would say 80% of the time it's not class related.
Oh. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So I do think that is a difference. I mean, I don't know that the people are necessarily different, but the opportunities to do other things while you're in class are now more present than they were before.
Ryne, there are a few papers that you did contributed, and there is a kind of a social media, I would say, frenzy going on, that this millennial generation is a hookup generation, that they have more sexual intercourse, they don't commit, they have more sexual partners, but actually what empirical data show that actually this isn't true. Would you tell us something more about it?
Yeah, sure. So my collaborators and I got interested in this in part because there was this, and one of my collaborators is Jean Twangy, who's done a lot of work on millennials and I generation folks. She has a couple of books on it. And one of the things that got us interested in this was popular media reports about the hookup generation, right? And they were saying things like, oh, because of apps like Tinder, right, where you swipe left or swipe right, that's all young people are interested in. They're only interested in short-term relationships, no long-term commitments, and they just want to have sex really quickly and then leave. But the problem with this was that much of the sort of evidence, if we'll call it that, for this was based on personal interviews. For example, I know one reporter went from college campus to college campus and basically set up a little shop in the student union area and said, hey, come tell me about your sex life. Well, I mean, there's kind of a problem here is that, you know, not everybody wants to share all the details of their sex life with somebody who's just sitting around, right? But the people who do, right, exactly. And the people who do want to share that information might be different from the people who don't. And so this is why it's really important to get a representative sample. And that's what we've done in the work that we've done. And what we found was quite the opposite of that. Although millennials have a more positive, we might call it more positive attitudes towards sex. For example, they think it's more acceptable to have sex outside of marriage than other people do. They think it's more acceptable to have some homosexual sex than other people do. So millennials' attitudes on sex are more permissive. Their behavior doesn't seem to be, particularly, you know, given their age and given the time period in which they live. So, if we look at sexual behavior, for example, right? So let me step back a second. So how do you know? How can you tell that it's a generational effect and not something else? How do you know that it's millennials versus the time period versus being young, right? That's one of the big criticisms of, you have to always be careful of when you're talking about generational differences, is age and generation seem like they're the same thing, right? Aren't young people also millennials, and aren't older people boomers, and aren't, right, you know, those kinds. But you can actually do this with the right kind of study designs. You can actually separate age effects from generational effects. And what we've shown is that given their age, so still young people are having some sexual peak is somewhere between in the 20s, right? Mid 20s to early 30s, somewhere in there. People are having sex the most frequently. What we've shown is that it's true that young people today are still having the most frequent sex at that age. It's lower than you would expect given the time period in which they're living and given their age. So it's actually on the decline.
What I liked, there was an article that you also contributed. It's called Millennials Having Less Sex Than Other Generations. And there were, among you, there also asked a few other experts why where is the actual problem or the cause of it. Do you remember that interview maybe?
It's possible. I did many interviews when that paper came out. Well, I mean, there are a handful of possibilities, and that's the one downside of these data sets, is that, you know, they're not experiments, and we really can't pinpoint any one particular cause. We have done some work to rule out some possibilities. So like when we first started doing this work, some people said, I even got letters in the mail that would say, oh, I know what it is. It's pornography. It's because people are having less sex because of access to pornography on the web. They don't need sex anymore because they have pornography. And well, this is an interesting hypothesis. So in one of the later papers, we actually looked at that. And what we found was that people who reported watching pornographic movies or films or anything were actually reporting having more sex, if anything. Mm-hmm. So that seemed to be like, oh, it's not pornography. People who are saying that they're watching pornography are actually reporting having more sex. Mm-hmm. Another thing that people said to us was, you know what it is? It's the work-life balance. Is that people are it's too far towards work. People are working too much. They don't have time, right? A lot of people were millennials that were being interviewed were saying this, especially young women. They were saying, well, I'm too busy for a relationship. I'm in a career and I'm doing, and so we looked at that too. And what we found was that hours worked was actually also positively correlated with having more sex. So it didn't seem like it's actually the wrong direction. If it was, oh, we're working too much, that wouldn't be the case. So we ruled those two things out. So what's left? Well, a host of things. One is social media. If you can use social media to sort of entertain yourself, right, or interact with other people without actually being with other people face to face, then there's obviously less opportunity for sex to happen. But another one, and I guess if you had to make me place a bet, right, on what is it, I think it has things to do with awareness about STDs, sex education, that these kinds of things are convincing millennials to be a little more careful, right? So I think it means both things, that they're comfortable with whatever sex other people want to engage in, but they're choosing for their own self, hey, I don't have to do that, right? In part because of sexual education. And the reason I think this is the most likely is because this is consistent with a whole host of other behaviors that we see millennials are different from. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, is reporting that that young people today use less drugs than previous generations. They are less likely to drink alcohol than previous generations. Mm-hmm. They're more likely to use condoms than previous generations. So they're engaging in a whole set of sort of safe or less risky behaviors than previous generations. And I think that let's be clear, it's not that they're not having sex, it's that they're having less sex than you would expect given their age. I think this is a result of trying to be less risky.
Yeah. What would you say, also in this article, Dr. Michael Aaron, he's a sex therapist, said about a hookup culture. He said that hookup culture means more time choosing sex partner, less time actually having sex. Meaning that he gave an example. You have a store with 30 different types of ice cream. In the other one, 3. And actually in the first one, people didn't actually pick any because more options that you give, people become more inactive in
right.
So would you say that's true?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, right? So yeah, the idea is that because of apps like Tinder and several other sort of dating websites and things like that, you spend a lot of time trying to find the right person instead of any time with an actual person. Mm-hmm. And that's a sensible idea there. I do think it is a challenge in some ways because so most dating website apps don't work this way, but apps like Tinder do, where you're basically deciding whether or not you want to be in a relationship with someone based on a one shot, right? You've got one photo and you're deciding immediately, do I want to be in a relationship with this person?
Mhm.
There was an interesting article on the Tinder economy recently that was really quite interesting, that described, well, they showed, based on Tinder data, that 80, let me make sure I get this right, that about 80% of the women were only choosing from the top 20% of men. And so basically what it meant was the bottom 80% of men
Mhm.
were competing for the bottom 20% of women. They were never going to get an agreement except from anybody except in the bottom 20% of women, and they base physical attractiveness based on how many times people swipe right and left on you and things like that. So basically, the economics of it are really quite bad in terms of actually getting people together, because everybody's saying, I want to be with the most attractive person. And so the most attractive person, yeah, they're doing really well. They're getting lots and lots of people who swipe yes for them. And they can be extremely choosy, but for the most people, they don't get matches. And so, yeah, so in that way, it's very consistent with what this person said, is that you're spending a lot of time doing that, but not a lot of time with other people.
Yeah, yeah. But I also liked your quote that you said. You said, as far as I know, people still can't have actual sexual intercourse over the internet. So
Right, right. Yeah, so, I mean, that's the thing. If you're spending lots of time on the internet, and it's not just social media too. I mean, right, we have access to lots of ways to entertain ourselves through like Netflix and things like that. Um, that you might not go out. You might just say, "Oh, I don't need to go out. I'm just going to spend time by myself." And I think a lot of, or at least some, right, some sexual encounters, maybe in retrospect, you think, "Oh, geez, I wish I wouldn't have done that." But those kinds of things go away when you don't meet up with people, when you stay by yourself.
mhm. Ryan, what would you say to young millennials out there?
Well, a few things. One is that there's a lot of bad information about millennials out there, right? That there's a lot of stuff saying, oh, millennial, and this has gone on for a long time. So I want to be careful when the kinds of things that I'm talking about, and the kind of work that I've done, we're really careful about making sure that what we're looking at really is a generational difference and it's not something else, because a lot of things that have been said about millennials are really just about age. That's really just young people. This has happened for every generation. If you go back to ancient Greece, you can find writings from older people saying this young generation is ruining it, right? So everybody wants to pile on the young generations and say that they're doing this or they're doing that. And so, I mean, what I would say is ignore that. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think things are that bad for millennials. I think they'll be okay. I think they got dealt a bad hand around 2009 when the economy really crashed, and any millennials graduating looking for a career at that time were really in a bad spot, because I know many wanted to find work, but there was nobody willing to hire. Nobody wants to hire a 23-year-old with no experience. Like, why would we hire you when we've got other people and we're trying to lay people off, right? So that group, I think, did get dealt a bad hand. But I also think at the same time that there is a little bit of lack of preparation for the real world. And I don't know that this is a millennial thing or so much a young people thing, but that's one of the things that we're seeing, is that when you've taught a group of people, and this is one of the things my colleague Jean talks about, that they're great, they can do whatever they want, that they're all stars, right? And then you get to 22 years old and it's like, okay, it's time to find a job. And you realize, wow, everyone doesn't love me. I thought everybody would want to hire me and everybody would love me. And but I think this is true for a lot of people. I don't necessarily know this is true for the millennials, but I think that they need to be more prepared for that kind of thing, realizing that in the real world it's hard. It's hard to find a good job and it's hard to find a good boss. And you don't just get them just because you're you.
Mm-hmm. Ryne, is it any specifically that you try to get a message across with your teaching in a class?
In the classroom, we don't spend a lot of time talking about this, but I mean, what I would say is I hold my students to standards that that I think are fair. I do get a lot of emails. I'm not sure if this has changed over the years, but I do get a lot of emails around final exam time or right after the final grades have been posted saying things like, oh, if there's anything I can do, what can I do to get my grade up? Is there any extra credit opportunities? And these are things that are done after the fact. And so the one thing that I do is I hold my students to that standard of, no, this is how it really works. If you've not made the deadline, if you haven't done things before now, then there's no opportunities later. And so I think that's probably the main thing that I do in my classroom.
Yeah, good lesson. Ryne, I would like to thank you for sharing your expertise and personal
Sure.
also opinion, and thank you for being here with me today.
Of course, this is great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And to Modern Adulthood community, thank you for joining me. Tune in tomorrow for more interviews to come. Bye.